Hey everyone, I'm David Bailey. Thank you for coming tonight. And just to preface this kind of talk, I'm probably going to run out of time. I could talk about this for like hours, as many of you know. So I'm going to be flying through this. I'm going to be skipping stuff. So after the fact, if I miss something, feel free to catch me and ask me a question. Tonight I'm going to be discussing the fall of empires. And to kind of start this conversation, I think it's maybe best to kind of tell you my journey to how I made some of these observations and how I kind of came to some of these conclusions. So as you can see there, I'm majoring in finance and management. I'm also dual tracking for a master's in finance. And I'm really a finance nerd. I have 7 years of investment experience. I've founded 2 student-managed equity funds. I served on the CIMG board of directors for several years, and I also have a lot of experience in kind of the financial sphere as far as I've worked for a hedge fund, I've worked in venture capital for a foundation, and in 2009 I started at MFI on campus. So I really am into numbers, I'm really into trying to make things work sustainably, so I think I have a good perspective to share on this topic. And I guess the best place to start is in 2006 when I made my first investment into GE. Now, 2006 was like the golden age of investing into stocks. You could pick any stock, you're guaranteed to make money basically, and it made you kind of think to yourself like, wow, I'm really good at this, I can make a bunch of money. So I feel like this quote is the perfect one to maybe exemplify that idea. Stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. That was infamously said in 1929. And that's kind of how I felt. But I was a skeptical person. I was always looking for a good deal. So when I saw bank stocks starting to fall in the year of 2007, I was like, maybe this is something I should look into. These banks, they're huge. Everyone is saying that you should buy them. And the only reason they're falling in price is because of this little thing called like a subprime bubble or something. I wasn't exactly sure what it was, but nobody seemed to really care at the time. And I think this quote is a great quote. Ben Stein said this on Fox News in August 2007. It's a buying opportunity, especially for the financials, maybe like I've never seen before in my life. All right, this is August 2007. But he wasn't alone. I mean, there was a lot of people that agreed with him, and I have a couple quotes. I'm not going to read all these, but real quick, some household names. Jim Cramer. Housing bubble, what housing bubble? Paul Krugman. Alan Greenspan needs to create a housing bubble to replace the NASDAQ bubble. And probably my favorite from the National Association of Realtors was said in August 2005, in their anti-bubble report, that there is virtually no risk of a housing price bubble. I can't make that out on the screen right here, but home prices are likely to continue to rise above historic norms. So being the skeptic that I was, of course, the smartest thing to do is to listen to those that are the experts, the people who fundamentally not only know how the economy works, but run the economy. So I kind of did just that, and I invested. So as you can see, though, maybe my first lesson in investing, my true lesson in investing was that cheap is a relative word. So you can see where in that chart Ben Stein said, buy of a lifetime. You can see where it ended up not too long later. And from peak to trough, on this investment, I lost about 95%. So a lot of money to lose, all right? And it kind of made me start to wonder, why did I lose this money? How did I not understand what was going on? How did I miss this? And I said, well, surely, nobody saw this coming. And you can kind of look at the results. The Dow Jones fell by 53% in 17 months. It was like Great Depression type stuff. I mean, some of these days were like crazy. And you can look here at Bank of America CEO Ken Lewis saying in November 26, 2008, one of the strongest and most stable major banks in the world. What he didn't mention, though, at the time was that Bank of America had $100 billion bailout effectively from the government that if they didn't have, they'd go bankrupt. But he obviously made that statement thinking that the bank was safe and secure. So clearly, nobody could have seen this coming, right? Well, you can go home and Google this yourself, but actually it turns out that a lot of people saw this coming. There was a lot of people who made a lot of money investing on the basis that this would eventually collapse, and you can read quotes here, one from the chief risk officer of Freddie Mac, in mid-2004 said that the company was buying bad loans that would pose an enormous financial risk to the financial and the reputational risk to the company and the country. And then one of my personal heroes, Ron Paul, said in 2003 from the floor of Congress, like all artificially created bubbles, the boom in housing prices cannot last forever. When housing prices fall, homeowners will experience difficulty as their equity is wiped out, yada, yada, yada. Basically, he perfectly described what happened. And this is kind of shocking because you're wondering to yourself, all right, Ken Lewis runs Bank of America, not Ron Paul. So how did Ron Paul see this and Ken Lewis didn't see this, or any of the financial experts? This is a pretty serious question. I had us keep looking to figure out what is the reason for this. And I kind of went back and I started doing some research on financial crises. And what I found was that in a 20-year period, these once in a 100-year crises actually seem to happen like almost every year or every other year. So when you look at this, what's amazing is that in school we don't really spend too much time talking about why these crises actually happen, but that the people who were in charge of the economy or overseeing major banks or financial institutions at the time, today, even still today, were in charge of these same institutions 10, 15 years ago. So all this stuff happened on their watch. So this kind of brought me to this conclusion that's pretty profound, I guess, and there's a lot of implications, and we're going to talk about one of those today, but that experts really have no idea what they're talking about. Or worse, maybe they do know what they're talking about, but they say it anyway, which we won't even go down that road. So I learned you can't really take what you hear as truth or you're going to lose a lot of money. So any person who's investing can tell you that the most important component to the health of a nation is the underlying economy of that nation. So if all these people who didn't really know what they were talking about were running our economy, then surely if we look back in history, you should see some impacts of people running an economy into the ground, and that should have some impacts on nations. So I kind of went back and started studying history that we learn about in class, but we never really dive that deep into. And I started looking at empires. Now, if you look at these empires, I just threw these up here. There's a lot of different empires clearly out there. But I found that there's a pattern that basically was reoccurring in all these empires. Basically a pattern of people who didn't really know what they were talking about, but pretended that they did know what they were talking about, running the institution or the empire and making decisions for everyone that eventually blew up in their face and caused a lot of headaches for a lot of people. So I'm going to very briefly kind of run through some of these empires and those mistakes that they made, and we're going to look at them from a policy lens. And then I'm going to try to very briefly touch on American policy and see if there's maybe any overlap here. So there's 4 policy mechanisms. There's domestic policy, foreign policy, fiscal policy, and monetary policy. And under domestic policy, the key part of domestic policy is really controlling the people that make up the empire. Rome is a great example of this. Emperors invested very heavily into entertainment. And I pulled a quote from 100 AD, which I think exemplified this. People who once upon a time handed out military command, high civil office and legions, everything now restrained itself and anxiously hoped for just 2 things, bread and circuses. So public appeasement is really taking care of the basic necessities so that the public at large doesn't challenge your policies because everything that they need is taken care of. And it also has to do with the consolidation of power into one centralized authority. So the French monarchy was really smart about this. They built this Palace of Versailles, and they invited all the nobles to Versailles, and basically there were no nobles that were trying to build their own fiefdom to challenge the king. They were all worried about who's wearing what and who sits closest to the king at dinner time. So it's a very powerful tool, it's a very important part of domestic policy is making sure that one person or a small group of people are making most of the decisions. And there's several other components to domestic control. We won't spend too much time on it, but divide and conquer. You want to polarize the public so that way there's not somebody who can challenge your authority or your policies. The Spanish Empire is maybe a great example of this. The Spanish Inquisition, we've all heard of that. And everybody's like, oh, it's so crazy. How could anybody think that if a lady sunk, then she wasn't a witch, but if she floated, she's a witch? How could anybody think that? Well, the truth is that the king and queen were very smart. They didn't actually think that. But what they did know is that if everybody was trying to throw some person into the lake and determine whether she floated or not, and if she was a witch, they knew that what wouldn't be going on is everybody going, why are you taking 30% of my produce or my farm's goods or something in taxes? So it's a diversion, I guess is the best way to put it. Well, so that domestic policy of public appeasement is very expensive. So it requires the authority to basically use the military to ensure that the standard of living does not go down too drastically, because you don't want civil distress. So basically, if you look back, as all these productive assets are transferred from actually people trying to start a business or take care of basic necessities to building coliseums and building circuses and handing out free goods to the public, you need to be able to make up all that cost and all that expense by basically seizing natural resources that are out throughout your environment. So you can see this with every empire. They always pick on smaller nations, and they basically take their resources and use them at the benefit of the home city, I guess. And in order to be able to do this on a consistent basis, it requires you to have a professional standing army. So almost all empires, they start with a volunteer army. Eventually, they become this like mercenary army of, the Ottomans are a great example, Janissaries, which basically they're slaves' children they raised from birth so that they never questioned anything and they didn't know anything other than war. And empires always are the moral authority. So every time they invade another nation, it's always about liberty, it's about self-defense, it's about stopping or aiding an ally. It's never, oh, we're just invading because we need your natural resources. So Soviet Union is a great example of that. Now, so this is expensive. You have a military that you have all over the world trying to maintain an empire. You have a lot of money that you're spending on bread and circuses. So how do you afford that? You afford it through heavy taxation, which effectively means that you need to be able to collect taxes. So the higher the taxes become, the less people want to pay them. So you need more and more authority to basically ensure that taxation. So the Roman Empire is a great example of this. The Roman Empire had a problem as they raised taxes. Nobody wanted to pay. People started to flee. So they basically passed a law that tied people to the land that they worked on. So that way they could charge one person the tax in the local area, and then that person would be responsible for collecting taxes from everybody who was tied to the land. Well, when the Roman Empire eventually collapsed, this would be the start of feudalism in Europe. So this is kind of a system of serfdom, and ultimately it leads to the working class becoming like economically enslaved to the aristocracy or whoever runs the empire. And then this ultimately leads to societal decay as the middle class tried to emulate the aristocracy. They basically look down upon hard work, and they try to build wealth through financial resources like a bond or something like that. So a great example is this is in the 1500s. The Spanish Empire had something called Heros, which basically was the aristocracy investing heavily into government bonds that paid dividends, and they never really had to work a day in their life. And it effectively led to Spain losing all its manufacturing ability and all its productive capacity. Well, so eventually, taxes aren't enough. You can't afford everything you need just through taxes. So you have to debase your currency. That's like a hidden tax. People don't really understand that, if a nation controls a fiat currency, they can just print an infinite amount of it to pay whatever bills they need, and that has implications. So basically what happens is whenever you debase a currency, you're going to have shortages of basic necessities like bread or wheat. So as you do that, and this happens every time, I promise, a country always has to respond, or an empire responds, using price controls. If we can control the price of the goods, then everybody can have as many goods as they need. Well, this causes shortages, and it causes black markets to develop, and it basically causes trade to break down in a legitimate way and pushes everything towards a gray or black market. So this is a kind of a self-defeating policy, and what's important to realize about all these policies is they're like dominoes. Each policy requires you to enact the other policy in order to maintain kind of the status quo. So ultimately, these price controls will fail. They always fail. And what ends is you either have hyperinflation or you have civil distress. And I think the French monarchy is maybe the best example of this. There was not enough bread. It caused a panic in the countryside, as it's known, or the Great Fear. And ultimately, this was the start of what would become the French Revolution. So I know I'm about to be kicked off the stage before too long, but I'll very quickly go through this. Let's take like 1 second and bring this kind of close to home and reflect on maybe the policies of the United States and see if they overlap with the same kind of policy mistakes that were made by other empires. So on domestic policy, we basically have a civilian population that doesn't really have much say in how governments run and unanimously hates government. I mean, you can look at that statistic right there, 12% approve of the job that Congress is doing. That's not a very great approval rate. We have a very polarized and divided population. All power is centralized in Washington, D.C., or most of it. You maybe can see that with some of the debate over marijuana policy and how difficult it is for some states to just have medical marijuana. And we have mass incarceration, and I actually learned this statistic as I was looking it up, and I thought I'd have to add it. We have more people in jail now in the United States than the peak incarceration rate of the USSR. And we all think of the USSR as this police state. Well, we have more people in jail now than they ever had in jail. So I was pretty amazed by that, but we'll keep kind of scrolling through these. Foreign policy. We have a foreign policy of preemptively invading weaker nations that just happen to also be resource rich. And we've always done it under the guise of protecting our liberties, or self-defense, or aiding an ally. So we have an official policy of using what's called soft torture techniques or waterboarding, indefinite detention, targeted assassinations by drones throughout the world and in any country. We have a rapid expansion of the use of mercenary armies. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Blackwater, but we're currently employing over 260,000 contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's more than we actually have soldiers there, which was also a statistic that kind of amazed me. And these aren't like wars that are going to stop anytime soon. The war on terror is an indefinite war. I mean, are the terrorists just going to miraculously give up and decide that terrorism doesn't work anymore? So this is kind of a little bit worrisome, but we'll keep going. Oh, well, before I forget this, I don't know, this is maybe a challenge to each of you. Can you think of the last 5 nations that the United States has bombed? Because if you can't, that's kind of scary to think that there's such a disconnect between the population and the military that we don't even know what nations we're bombing anymore. So I listed some of them on there in just in case you can't remember, but Mali, Libya, Sudan, Yemen, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq. All right, fiscal policy. We haven't had a budget in about 5 years. The sequestration that we've heard so much about in the media recently, that's 1 day of government spending, just 1 day. So we basically had a big debate about whether government should take a 1-day holiday, all right? And when you take the national debt, you include unfunded liabilities. If we ceased all spending today, we're talking about $480,000 worth of liabilities per US man, woman, and child, so all people. Which I don't know how much money y'all have, but that's a little bit more than I have to pay in taxes. And then monetary policy. We have a policy of basically as much monetary easement as we need, QE1, QE2, QE3, I don't know how familiar you are with this, but the effect of this is inflation. Now, we're told that we have no inflation, but if we just have a little bit of a memory and look back just 10 years ago or a couple years, we have gas in 2002 at $1.20, $3.70 today. That sounds a lot like inflation. I don't know how many people have gone to the grocery store lately, but things are expensive at the grocery store. And it's created this dichotomy that 1% of the population owns 42% of the financial assets. That is a huge disparity in income between the richest and the poorest. And I'm not sure it's one that's exactly sustainable. So if the United States is an empire or not is maybe a question to be debated. But what's important is that if empires have fallen in the past, we have to understand the root causes that creates the collapse of a nation. And if we don't kind of ask ourselves what are the causes, are we doing the same thing, then we're going to be totally blindsided to the fact when some crisis does occur, just as I was blindsided by the financial crisis because I never really understood the root causes the root consequences, I guess, of just being ignorant. And so I leave this last quote here before I get off the stage. I know this is way over. But not only have individual financial institutions become less vulnerable to shocks from underlying risk factors, but also the financial system as a whole has become more resilient. This is Alan Greenspan, the head of the Federal Reserve, basically a finance god for about 15 years. And this is him in 2004. So I just challenge you to think critically for yourself, and when an expert tells you that everything is going glowingly and don't worry about anything and just place your trust in them, don't do it, because it's going to be a very expensive decision. All right, thank you.